So, dear guests and colleagues, my name is Markku Kangaspuro and I'm director of the Aleksanteri Institute. I want to welcome all of you here in our Aleksanteri Conference. Liberation, freedom and democracy are grand epithets. Their appeal has put in motion nations, classes, ethnic and identity groups to reach grandiose achievements, starting from improving people's political and social rights to independence of nations. Movements under the banners of these slogans have inspired many individuals who have become prominent leaders of groups seeking these virtues. Many of these leaders have become symbols of entire era, but also dropped from divine pedestal back to the one of mortal fellow citizens, if not a symbol of past wrongdoings during the flux of history. After 1918, starting point of this conference timing, Lenin became not only a symbol of Soviet Union, but also for many political mass movements of the East. Lenin was one symbol of victory of Mao's Red Army in China's civil war in 1948-49, victorious liberation movements of many Asian and African colonized nations used in turn Mao and Lenin as their symbols in 1960s and 70s. Zeitgeist of Europe made of them symbols of big number of radicalized students and youth in Western Europe in 1968 movements. Irony of history is that at the same time when colonized nations fought and youth demonstrated from liberation, freedom and democracy, the Soviet tanks crushed dreams of more democratic human-faced socialism in Prague in spring 1968. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1999, Lenin's statues have been turned over all over the former Eastern Europe and Soviet Union. In Ukraine, Lenin's fall has become a symbol of battle over identities, building Ukrainian nation, ethnic assessment of Soviet past, Russian and Ukrainian language, and so forth. Lenin has been replaced by taking Stepan Bandera as a symbol of liberation of the nation from Russian influence. In Russia, President Putin has claimed that Lenin's nationalist policy set a smoldering bomb in the foundation of the Soviet Union and eventually destroyed it. Liberation, freedom, democracy have been used in different times for different purposes, starting from decent goals ending up to the propaganda and camouflage of hidden agendas. In a one way, they are empty signifiers, which is one reason why they have been used so many times as a flag for various movements and political groups aiming at different and even contradictory political goals. Vagueness and abstract meaning have made them useful slogans to inspire political movements to change prevailing situation, given intended and unintended results. Liberation, freedom, democracy, they are concepts of modern 20th century mass societies and their political movements, nationalism, socialism, liberalism and fascism. They have also temporal and spatial dimension. Collapse of Ottoman and European Habsburg and Russian empires in 1918 meant liberation, freedom and democracy for new established nation states in the Eastern Europe and Balkans. But like Hannah Arendt writes in her Origins of Totalitarianism, freedom for one group of or nation didn't automatically lead to equal results for all others. She wrote that the imperialism and PAN movements at that time, should we speak nowadays about globalization or something else, undermined from outside the nation-state order of Europe, which ridiculized all others' sovereignty than big powers won. Arendt's conclusion was that the dispersion of nation-states started already in 1918, immediately after the First World War, as a consequence of establishment of this new, different type of nation-states. They consisted of titular nations and numerous ethnic minorities without equal rights with the majority. Massive movements of immigrants caused by revolutions and unrest of the new states increased the tension in the societies receiving immigrants. Arendt points out that discrimination of minorities led to degeneration of rule of law, denialism of equal human rights, and dehumanization of immigrants and also many other minority groups. Quote, European nation states were not able to guarantee human rights to immigrants who had lost their civil rights in their own home countries. Oppressor governments were able to force also their opponents to follow their oppressors' values. Those whom oppressors had stigmatized as a scum, Jews, Trotskyists, and so forth, were perceived everywhere, like the lowest of the low. End of the quote. Reading this, I can't avoid to think the contemporary discussion on immigrants and refugees in Europe and in the United States. As Arendt points out, new European nation-states were established for liberated ethnic majority nations, and democratic rights of these states were determined by ethnic origins of people. In the end of this development was irredentism and finally the annexation policy of Nazi Germany ending up to the World War. After the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, Francis Fukuyama declared that the Western liberal democracy had won and history ended. This was materialized in the enlargement of the European Union value-based policy and liberal world order. Triumph of democracy looked irreversible when the European Union integrated new former Eastern European member states into the sphere of liberal world order. Authoritarianism and limited freedoms were left behind and supposed to exist only beyond the core Europe. This optimistic vision lasted until financial crisis of 2008, Russian-Georgian war in the same year, subsequent Russia's more aggressive politics and millions of refugees coming from Middle East and Africa, which has put resilience of European societies and their liberal values in test. In 2018, Fukuyama came back to the topic and reassessed his thesis on the final victory of liberalism and spoke the temptation of authoritarianism in societies hit economic recession and increase in unequal distribution of wealth. Now, century after the foundation of the Soviet Union that collapsed less than 20 years ago, Fukuyama and many other American academics believe that capitalist market economy needs more socialism, like they have conceptualized their policy of state regulation of markets and broader model of welfare society. Meanwhile, the Nordic countries are struggling to save their welfare society under the pressure of public sector budget cuts. The discussion in the US is referring them as a model of good societies. Perhaps Hegelian perfect rational form of society is still waiting to become true. Dear colleagues, In this year's 18th Aleksanteri Conference, we are discussing on these and many other issues and topics, in particular in Eastern Europe, Balkan and Baltics. The organization committee, led by University Lecturer of Eastern Europe, Katalin Miklóssy, who is not unfortunately been able to be present today here, and consisting of colleagues from Aleksanteri Institute and other departments of the University of Helsinki. It has worked intensively and devotedly to make this conference successful and give deserved visibility to Eastern European, Balkan and Baltics studies. This conference is also a main event of Russian Media Lab research project coming to the end in the next summer. You can find its panels devoted to freedom of speech, interaction of media and society, media economy and so forth from every session. I'm sure you will find interesting sessions to attend of among 200 conference presentations. I'm glad to see that we are here more than 400 colleagues taking part, coming from 30 countries. I hope that you enjoy of the program and have a good discussions here, meet good friends and new colleagues. In particular, I want finally encourage you to look at our excellent, versatile cultural program. It is the outcome of our talented organization committee members and their beautiful contacts to creative people and artists out of the university. Dear colleagues, you are making the special spirit of the conference. You are warmly welcome. The 18th Aleksanteri Conference is opened. Next, I want to invite our ceremonial speaker, Professor Marju Lauristin, to the podium. Marju Lauristin is a professor of social communication at Tartu University. She has published widely on development of Estonian society and Estonia-Europe relations and media. And she is a prominent public figure in societal discussions in Estonia and Europe. Lauristin has also a prominent political career. She is a former member of European Parliament and a Minister of Social Affairs. And currently, she is a member of Tartu City Council. Please, the floor is yours.
Dear friends, it's always a pleasure to be here in Helsinki University. Almost my alma mater, because I was elected the Doctor of Honoris Causa of this university, and that was a very, very big event in my life. And especially pleasant is to be here today, and I am very thankful for your invitation to meet all these people who are making this kind of very unique, very important work of research devoted to developments in Russia and on the Russian and Finnish, Baltic and other neighbors, say, bridge. Finland have been really very active and very successful in keeping this bridge open, even in times when it was quite difficult. For us in Estonia during Soviet time, Finland was really the only window open to the West. That is one of the paradoxes of our lives, that Finland have himself also believed that they are in the West compared to Estonia. Only when we looked at the map, we understand that Finland is in the north and we are in the south. Happily now today we are together in the West. But we have not to forget that that is really the result of very, very strong efforts to remain in Finland, to be built up again in Estonia, the democratic, independent states. And this conference today has a very symbolic time frame. Estonia and many other countries in this side of Europe are celebrating really the rebirth or birth of independent nation states from the fires, turmoils, and catastrophes of the First World War and as aftermath of Russian Revolution. And this celebration, in this sense, has its very painful background. But this start, if it is a start for Finland, is a bit earlier than for Estonia. The start of this road to democracy, you know, it was interrupted in 20th century by the other catastrophe, the Second World War, but before that, the replacement of this dreamland of democracy and freedom and humanism in Europe by two awful totalitarian regimes, Nazi Germany and Bolshevik Russia. And I think that what we are doing here with you today is to try to draw lessons, to understand the lessons of history. And for that, 68 is really a very special year. It is a special year not only because there were certain events and movements. It's a special year also from the viewpoint of understanding and learning. And learning, for example, that the same things, the same events, even the same numbers, could be absolutely differently interpreted, understood, and remembered from different sides of Europe. Europe in this time of 68 was divided. It was divided by the Iron Curtain. And this Iron Curtain was a very thick and very cruel barrier between our part of Europe, our mean now those who were under so-called socialist camp, and the other part of Europe, which was on the other side in so-called free world. And fortunately for Finland, Finland was on the side of freedom. We were on the side of real, let's say, political slavery, let's tell it like that. And in this western side of Europe and in the world, 68 really celebrated as the time of the youth revolution. The youth awakening, the students taking over the streets, students taking over the cities, students really showing that new generation born in the war, after war, have grown up and want to take over the world following new values, looking for new ideals, having new dreams, not dreams of more and more consuming more and more goods, not dreams of having better cars, not dreams of more and more entertainment, but dreams of becoming better people, dreams of love between people, dreams of equality between nations, dreams of freedom from everybody in the world. This celebration of love, the celebration of spiritual freedom, even if it later on faded away and showed its weaknesses and maybe also some uglier sides, it has remained in our memories as a call for brighter future, brighter humanity. We very often speak about generation of 68. But when I meet with people from West, then they are always surprised when they understand that the 68 meant a bit different thing for people in the East. Not only in Prague, because everybody is speaking about Prague. But Prague, it was a symbol. Prague, it was really the hotspot. Prague was a place where this, say, explosion happened. But in all other countries of this socialist camp, this explosion also was not only felt, but also there were own explosions, own movements. And here, for example, in Estonia, in my university city, Tartu, we had strong student movements, we had clashes with KGB, we had hopes that so-called Czech Spring will become also Baltic Spring. And generation of 68, we then, being students, we also retained these dreams, these hopes for the future. And I dare to say that what happened in Europe in 88, 89 really was prolongation. It was really very much creation of this generation of 68. The continuation of this unfinished project, like Habermas is calling it. And now, in 2018, we have to look and evaluate the successes, failures, undoings, and still unaccomplished tasks of this project. I think it's very important to do it. It's very important to discuss those things also here on this conference. It's very, very important conference. And it's important conference especially because it's, like I said, it's conference uniting people with different experiences from the eastern and western side of the border. But may I make some hint or say a word of mild warning? When I was looking at the book of this program and these short descriptions, then certainly they are not reflecting everything which will be discussed and then told. But I had some feeling that we have to make a bit more conscious effort to find a new language, to find more comprehensive, maybe more sensitive language to describe, analyze, and understand what is going on in this Europe after 68, after 89, after 2014, where these previous prisoners of socialist camp were accepted membership in EU. What is going on now? What is going on with Brexit? What is going on in Europe between Trump, Putin, and Erdogan? It's too easy to use this clear, visible mapping east-west. But it's not working if you look at Trump, what it has to do with east and west. It's something else. It is also quite easy to say, oh, we know that's old nationalism. This old nationalism is already again rising ahead and it is dangerous. But we have to look that in countries like Finland, by the way, national feelings haven't brought destruction, but creation of the prosperous, open, democratic, friendly educated country. Being not only close friends, but we consider ourselves to be the family members with Finns in the bigger family. We are very proud having this not only neighbor, but a brother or sister, I don't know, because our languages don't make difference between genders, you know. And also in Estonia, in many other countries, we can also see that the so-called national part of our consciousness, of our values, could be open and creative, not only destructive and ugly. So what is making this difference? Why it is different in different countries? And when now it was mentioned that the idea of liberal democracy, this dream that now liberal democracy will be overwhelming everywhere, meaning for everybody freedom, for everybody human rights, for everybody the dignity of every person in the world, have now showing its weakness and is severely attacked by the forces, what I will call maybe new authoritarianism. Why these forces are becoming so popular? Why not in so-called Eastern Europe? In Eastern Europe, by the way, if you take so-called new members of EU, then only in 2 of them you see that these forces have been winning. But even look at Sweden, what happened on Swedish elections. Look at Germany. Being in European Parliament, I have been listening on every plenary Marine Le Pen. And you can only imagine what happened with France if Marine Le Pen will win elections. So what it is? What is going on? What they have neglected in our rhetoric, in our practices, in our politics. And I think we have to be very critical, we have to be wise, and we have to be quick. Why quick? Because it's big time pressure, it's shortage of time to understand what is going on. Because there are new forms of totalitarian regime, new digital totalitarianism already on the horizon. Look at the use of new possibilities of algorithmization, of manipulation, used by Russia, but by some others also. Look at the China emerging as a new power, liberated from poverty and then having own dreams, but already applying its digital developments to control the everyday lives of the people, with the depths and strengths unimaginable even in these industrial old European totalitarian regimes. Being in European Parliament, what we there had was really already everyday fight between these people, politicians from Europe, East and West, the same, who see the human rights and democracy as a main value of Europe, which we have to protect in this world, that to protect, to cherish, and to, to arm philosophically, scientifically, technologically, to be capable to stand this pressure from this new totalitarian movement. And what was the opposition? Opposition, it wasn't so much these visible forces of this new authoritarianism. The worst really threat and danger was coming from these forces, politicians, who said, oh, don't worry, that's business as usual. It's a business model. It has nothing to do with any kind of democracy, non-democracy. What is human rights? Human rights, you know, it's a last utopia. We have to forget about human rights. What they're talking, it's something from the past. It's 19th century. It's philosophy. Who wants philosophy nowadays? We want technology. And I suppose that here and elsewhere, when we discuss lessons of history, we are capable today not only look at that as something, say, like humanitarian hobby, but we have to understand that, namely, from this knowledge, from those lessons, we can get the strengths to withstand to this new authoritarianism and new totalitarian tendencies in contemporary world. And Finland, I will say, I hope together with Estonia, is one of the best places to think about those things. With our experience, with our smallness, which allows us to look at the world in the, I will say, with sufficient humbleness, but at the same time with high spiritual ambitions. So I wish you high spiritual ambitions. I wish you success in this conference, and I wish Aleksanteri-Institute to go on with more and more broadening its views and its influence in the spiritual area in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lauristin, very much of your words and inspiring thoughts. Next, I want to invite Vladimir Gelman to lead his panel discussion. Please.
Dear colleagues, I'm Vladimir Gelman, professor of Russian politics here at the Aleksanteri Institute and professor of the European University at St. Petersburg. And I'm happy to introduce you the first plenary session, which will include keynote speeches by our two distinguished guests. Professors Grzegorz Ekiert from Harvard University and Professor Katrin Voltmer from the University of Leeds. Please go to the floor. There will be two presentations and then Q&A session for both of our speakers. And the first presenter will be Professor Grzegorz Ekiert, who is Lawrence Tisch Professor of Comparative Politics and Director of Meredith Ginsburg Center for European Studies at Harvard University. He is known because of numerous books and journal articles on civil society and democratization in Eastern Europe, comparative politics of political transformations, and his talk will be devoted to analysis of transformation from communism to authoritarianism via democracy. So please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. This is a great honor and pleasure to address this conference, and thank you so much for this invitation. I think that Professor Lauristin set the right tone for the next few days. Liberalism and open society is under assault, and it's under assault everywhere. It's under assault as economic project, is under assault as political project, and is under assault as social emancipatory project. When you open the newspaper every morning, it seems like the world is increasingly being ruled by autocrats lunatics, and gangsters. I'm going to talk in the next 20 minutes about a very small portion of that landscape, about countries of Central Europe, which after almost 3 decades of very successful political and economic transition are turning their backs on democracy. Now, those countries are Poland and Hungary. This is the first time in the history of the European Union when 2 member states are being investigated for violation of rule of law. And it is the first time in the history of the European Union where 2 countries are breaching the fundamental values of the European Union. Now, the whole thing is becoming more puzzling because as recently as a month ago, Poland was declared the most successful economically country of the entire former Soviet bloc. Poland joined the list of 25 most advanced economies of the world. So we can ask the question, what the hell is going on? Why the most successful country where GDP per capita quadruple, where the living standards exploded, where all people have opportunity to travel, work, live everywhere in Europe, why that country is turning back on democracy. And could I, because I'm sort of losing the, okay, good. Now, so what I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes, really to quickly focus on 3 different things. So first of all, the surprises of post-communist transformations. Then I will briefly talk about what happened after 2004 in terms of backsliding in an authoritarian reversal. And I will talk a little bit about what explains what happened. Right, so that's the story. So where are we 30 years after 89? Where are we 30 years after the collapse of communist regimes? I think that there are several outcomes we can highlight today. So first of all, we have the extraordinary diversity of outcomes. The range of political regimes in the former Soviet space ranges from, quite amazing authoritarian places to almost fully established, fully consolidated democracies. The second thing which needs to be emphasized is that we have a striking geographic distribution of those outcomes. So when you travel from east to west and from north to south, you see that diversity. The east-west story is the old one, but the north-south story is a very interesting new one. All the indicators of economic development, all the indicators of quality of democracy are much lower in what was the southern part of the former Soviet bloc and much higher in what was the northern part of the former Soviet bloc. Also, economic reforms, economic success, and political reforms and political success go together. There are very few countries, or none of the countries, which were successful economically and failed politically, and vice versa. Moreover, what we see over the last 30 years are very stable trajectories. We have when we look at the sub-regions of the former Soviet bloc, we see the countries moving on the sort of parallel trajectories. There are no dramatic changes in the fortune of sub-regions. Those fortunes are sort of stuck in the trajectory beyond they cannot move. And finally, what we see is the stagnation of reforms, the consolidation of authoritarian rule, and the backsliding of those countries which became democratic. Just let me give you just 2 examples. So here are the data from Freedom House All of you know that set of research very well, which shows the following thing, right? At the beginning of the transition, we have a group of countries which started to democratize very fast. And in a very short period of time, this group of countries joined Western Europe and Southern Europe to be considered consolidated democratic regimes. On the other hand, the other groups of countries in the regions were moving on those sort of parallel tracks. So that illustrates a couple of points I already made. Let me give you one more illustration, putting together economic reforms and political reforms. So countries which were really successful politically became successful economically as well. And the countries which did not, reach any did not introduce any political reforms were also not very successful in economic reforms. Okay, so if that's the case, I think we face two fundamental questions. So first of all, what explains the diverging trajectories of post-communist transformations and why the countries of Central Europe, like Poland and Hungary and Czech Republic, were initially so successful? So that's question number one, and we have had, quite amazing debate on this issue over the last 30 years. And then the second critical question is what happened now that those most successful countries are moving back and turning away from democracy. Now, first of all, we need to think about answering those questions, as we were reminded before, in historical terms. Just to, give you one quotation which gets to the really, heart of the matter. Donald Horowitz, a great student of democratic transformations, mostly in Africa, said this, right, that there is no escape from the past. To understand the past means to understand the present state of politics, the present state of economy. So how do we explain the transformation, which were very successful at the very beginning, thinking about those historical factors? So I would say that, first of all, the historical factors and various historical legacies are very important as preconditions for liberal outcomes. We can think about this in terms of Central Europe vis-à-vis other parts of the former Soviet Union. So the most affluent countries in the region under the Soviet rule, and even before the war, became democracies very fast. Those countries which were not rich, which were very peripheral under the old regime, did not succeed in political and economic reforms. Being closer to Europe, being closer to European Union, having friendly relations with the West was a big plus. Those countries really were much more successful initially. Those countries who were successful were countries which introduced liberal economic reforms, but at the same time they were paying much attention to social safety net and welfare policies. In places like Hungary and Poland and Czech Republic, the spending on welfare triple and quadruple over what it was under the communist regime. Now, those countries also had relatively efficient states, well-functioning bureaucracies, and states which were accountable. And the last thing I'm going to use, the Gramscian term, we saw the ascendance of liberal historical bloc. Now, what does it mean? It means, paraphrasing Gramsci, that even those who did not like what was going on in Eastern Europe believe that there is no other way. So even those workers and trade union members in enterprises which were privatized, which were closed down, believed that liberal reforms are the way to go. And I think in the most successful countries, initially in the early 90s, you see those coalitions of people structurally in completely opposite positions who believe in the same thing. I'm emphasizing this because what we see now is the collapse of that liberal historical bloc, and what we see is the emergence of the new historical bloc, which is chauvinist, nationalist, anti-liberal. And I will talk a little bit more about this in the moment. So when those things started to fall apart, we think that, it happened relatively, a few years ago or a couple of years ago in Poland and other places and so on. But as a matter of fact, the sliding back started in 2004. It is paradoxical because this is the year when those countries joined the European Union, became the members of the European Union. And here again is Freedom House showing you how various countries were the scores of democracy in various countries were declining over time. We have very few, very tiny successes in places, where things were so bad that it would be very difficult not to succeed in improving a little bit the scores. But in the main countries, like Poland, like Slovakia, like Hungary, those scores are going down. Here's another look at this. Everyone since 2004 is losing the quality of democracy. And here are those two lines. This is Poland and this is Hungary, where that really decline was very dramatic. We also see that in economic dimension. Here is the graph from European Bank and Reconstruction and Development, showing the stagnation of economic reforms and reversal of economic reforms. And again, paradoxically, the highest number of reversals are coming from the countries which were the most successful members of the European Union. Now, looking at the populists in power, here we are. This is the concentration of populist rule in Europe today. And these are the countries for which we had such high hopes at the beginning of the transition, with all having populist governments of various kinds of coalitions. So what's going on in those countries? I'm going to be very brief just to talk a little bit about Hungary and difference between Hungary and Poland. This is a very famous poster about standing up from the knees because the populists are arguing that Polish governments, previous Polish governments, are kneeling and bowing to Brussels, and now we have to stand up and defend the nationalist cause. And of course, this nationalist cause start to smell quite unpleasant as we go again. So, Hungary first. This is the Prime Minister of Hungary. What is going on in Hungary today? The Hungary's consolidated hybrid regime. Orban secured parliamentary majority, changed the constitution several times, changed electoral law, captured media, captured state institutions. We can predict with 100% who is going to win the next election in Hungary. This is no longer democracy. This is not a tyranny, the way we know tyrannies from the past, but this is not longer democracy. Not liberal, but no longer democracy. Hungary needs EU because it's a small country and needs EU subsidies. So Orban is quite willing to make concessions when pushed very hard, although he's doing that less recently. Hungary is also what a great Hungarian sociologist called the post-communist mafia state. Now, the paradox is that the oligarchs emerged in Russia and other parts of the former Soviet Union in the kind of bottom-up process, neglected by the state by and large to a certain point. Now, in Hungary, it happened the other way around. This was Hungarian government who gave the subsidies to the friendly oligarchs, creating this new oligarchy which now supports Hungarian government. And the last thing about Hungary, which needs to be emphasized, is that the liberal opposition is in disarray. Now, what is even more tragic is the only party which can count on some sort of higher support is the fascist Jobbik. And the tragedy of the whole story is that when you look at who votes in various age groups for what kind of political parties, you see that the youngest people in Hungary vote in overwhelmingly for Fidesz and for Jobbik. This is really a great tragedy unfolding in Hungary, and this is something which we really need to understand. Why the young people who have all the opportunities which were never present in this part of the world are suddenly very unhappy about all of that. Now, of course, the Hungarian regime brought back anti-Semitism in completely open and transparent way, and of course, it is very anti-EU. So what about Poland? The Polish illiberal democracy is in a different stage and in a different type. The Poland is turning authoritarian in a hurry. They really have to break constitution, they really have to break laws and parliamentary procedures and so on. Orban had enough majority to change the constitutions, but the Polish ruling party don't have that time. Fundamentalist thinking and no concession is the prevailing mood. The opposition is totally demonized. There are traitors, thieves, murderers, scumbags. These are the words uttered from the Polish parliament. And there is this new historical bloc I mentioned. These are chauvinists, the nationalists, the church, extreme right organizations, and so on, emerging in Poland. And they have, on the top of everything, some loony international policy trying to build the opposition to the EU. This is the march of right-wing movements in Poland last year, and this is that combination I just mentioned. So these are the members of the Polish government with the infamous former Minister of Defense. This is the top of the Polish clergy, and above all of that, there is a fascist flag from the pre-war period of the fascist youth organizations. And we can, of course, multiply the ways in which we can describe how low the politics moved in those two countries. There is also something which I describe as salami tactics for the 21st century, where those governments are just slicing political institutions, slice by slice, taking over the state, taking over the media, taking over the economy, and so on. And now, if we apply the Levitsky and Ziblatt test, my two dear friends, they say there are four elements which points you to the direction of authoritarian rule. The weak commitment to democratic rules, the legitimization of the opposition, tolerance of violence, and attempts to restrict civil liberties in media. They think in those terms about the US, but this is even more visible in Central Europe. How much time do I have? 5 minutes, okay. Very quickly. So why are we surprised? I think that we missed a couple of very significant developments, or didn't pay enough attention to a couple of very significant developments. We didn't pay much attention to the cost of the round table agreements. They were hailed as, tremendous achievement, innovation in moving from authoritarian rule to democracy, but this was revolution without retribution. Those opposition movements can now point, here are those former communists, here are those former secret police members who succeeded in the new regime while we did not. We also didn't think that the issue of rule of law will be such an important cleavage in post-communist politics. It was clear from the very beginning that there were people who wanted the rule of law protecting in the process of those functionaries of the old regime, and people who wanted to have nothing to do with the rule of law, but who wanted to punish those who were the former rulers. We also did not pay enough attention to dilemmas of EU accession, and we did not notice the emergence of pillarized civil societies. We pay attention to liberal parts of civil society, but we didn't pay attention to conservative parts of civil society. Today in Poland, there is many more people involved in civil society organizations run by church, run by right-wing press, run by right-wing movements, than there are people involved in civic activities in liberal organizations. This is quite amazing story we miss. So what explains that state of affairs? There are four possible explanations which you see on the slide. So first explanation is the rebellion of transition losers. This is the way in which we explain the rise of populism in Western Europe. Economic problems, marginalizations, and those unhappy with inequalities, those unhappy with economic developments, try to find representation somewhere else. Of course, in Eastern Europe, in these two countries, this really does not apply. This is tremendous economic success. Just to look at the growth of GDP, Poland did not have a recession in 2008 and so on. So by and large, the economic explanation does not do much in explaining. Those countries have relatively low levels of poverty. Those countries have relatively low level of inequalities. And on the top of everything, people are happy. When they are asked, what's the situation of your family, whether it's good or bad, you see that the moment Kaczynski Peace Party grabbed the power, there were several, times many more happy people in Poland than there were those who were complaining about the transition. So the second explanation which we could think about, and this is more real one, would be to look at the previous 3 decades as a fake modernization. We started to believe that we are living in societies which really want democracy, which really want market economy, that they are very committed to various values of liberal idea. But when we look at the data, we look back and we discover that this was not true. This was our illusion about those countries. So let me just give you one example. Poland. Referendum for the democratic constitution. 42% participated in that referendum, and half, a little over half, voted in favor. That means that slightly over 20% of Polish society supported introduction of democratic constitution. And the 80% either didn't care or were against. And the same applies really a little bit different to EU accession. The third argument is about cultural backlash. You are all familiar with Ron Inglehart and Pippa Norris research. The indicators of this is the economic populism, anxiety about cultural identity, and very peculiar demographic profile of supporters. And of course, there is plenty of data to prove just exactly this, that these are the kind of people who vote for non-liberal parties in Eastern Europe. But the last explanation, I think, is something which I would like to advocate. So first of all, we have two things going on in the same place. We really did not acknowledge how much hardship transition away from communist rule created, how much anxiety, how much anomie. This was, first of all, the process of imposing modernity on those societies, very traditional societies. There were cultural traumas of multiple transitions, first away from communism, then joining the European Union. The world has been changing around those people for the last 30 years. And finally, for the first time, they were confronted with the other. For the first time in 50 years, they went to West European countries, and they thought that they are going to be welcomed with open arms. And those Polish workers suddenly discovered that they are only this higher than Ethiopians, and Pakistanis and others. They felt that they are the third-class citizens and the Europe really does not care about them. And it was the same situation with the migration to those countries. So this situation produced the resurgence of traditionalism and cultural polarization and some political hysteria which benefited the populist parties. Now, but the last thing of the story, last piece of the puzzle is something which I call the counter-revolution of the political minority. What we see both in Hungary and Poland and increasingly in many countries of the former Soviet bloc is a conscious effort by political minority to take over political power and change liberal political system. That counter-revolution is the counter-revolution really carried out by provincial political and economic elites, which have this distaste for laws and institutions which were built in 1989 transformation. They represent the ethnic nationalist conservative values as strong religious commitments, and they think that when they gain the majority in the parliament, they can do whatever they want. Now, that was going to be the last two sentences. When we were trying to figure out why fascism won in Europe, in several European countries in the intra-war period, we have three predominant explanations. One is a Marxist explanation, that this is about the crisis of capitalism and all the horrible things capitalism does. So Marxists thought that this is the mechanism which brings fascists to power. Now, the second explanation was explanation in terms of modernization theory. These are traditional societies which are really being exposed to global competition, liberal values, and so on, and they simply don't like it. That is why they vote for fascist. And then there is a third explanation, which I think really is sort of reminiscent of what is going on in Eastern Europe today. This is an explanation that this is not about working class, this is not about traditional elites, but this is really about middle classes and petty bourgeois. These are people who don't like capitalism. These are people who don't like modernization. These are people whose life were disrupted in one way or another. And these are people who want to really keep things the third way, against liberalism and against capitalism. So I think that's is the social glue which keeps this counter-revolution going on in Central Europe today alive. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the great talk, and let me introduce Professor Katrin Voltmer. She is a professor of the School of Communication at the University of Leeds, United Kingdom. And Professor Voltmer published extensively on the role of media in transitional democracies. One of her books got an international award as a best book by the journal Press and Politics. And now, floor is yours, please.
Yeah, thank you for the kind introduction, and also many thanks to the organizers for inviting me to this conference, which I'm very much looking forward to. And it's a great honor to speak here in this very beautiful hall. So quite a lot of the themes I want to talk about in my presentation is actually a continuation of what has been said before. But I take a slightly different perspective, if you like, a perspective from below, both geographically and also socially. So, yeah, okay, that looks familiar. Okay. Yes, just to zoom in or out. Today, there are about 2/3 of countries worldwide which can be classified as democratic, in the sense that they have introduced at least basic democratic institutions like elections. But if you are now thinking, 2/3, I wouldn't have guessed that it is so many. I think you are right, because many of these democratic newcomers deviate markedly from the Western model of liberal and representative democracy. And they are on very different trajectories on the way between authoritarianism and democracy, and hopefully not too many back. So the democratization scholars, Larry Diamond and Mark Plattner, talked about the global divergence of democracy to indicate the growing diversity and variation of democracy in democratic practices, institutions worldwide. So with the expansion of with the global expansion of democracy, the very nature of what we mean by democracy is becoming increasingly blurred and indeed increasingly disputed, not only among scholars, but also and foremost between political camps in transitional societies. So this leads to a couple of important and maybe unsettling questions. One is, how universal is democracy? Are there some cultures that are incompatible with democracy? This is a question which has been discussed in relationship with Islam, but sometimes you also have this discussion with regard to Russia. How far can democracy travel, and what happens to democracy when it is adopted in cultures outside the Western orbit? And this happened in particular after '89, when democracy expanded far beyond European influences to countries in Asia and Africa. And then, how flexible is the concept of democracy? Is divergence, as Diamond and Plattner talk about, is divergence simply deviation from the right path? Or are there viable alternatives of the model of liberal representative democracy based on free market economies as it is practiced in the West? And are there alternatives to this? So while many countries around the world struggle to adopt the Western model of democracy, there's also a very interesting growing debate in non-Western countries about alternative forms of doing democracy, not necessarily anti-democratic discourses. This is quite important to remember, but alternatives of doing democracies which are perceived to be more in tune with local cultures. For example, there is a debate surrounding Asian values you might have heard about, which emphasizes societal harmony and order in contrast to individualistic and competitive notions of Western liberal democracy. There's also an emerging discussion about African democracy, drawing on traditional values like Ubuntu, which is broadly translated as humanity, a concept that places the individual within the community. To be very sure, these debates are often hijacked and even initiated by political elites with the aim to legitimize authoritarian practices. For example, Asian values have become particularly popular with authoritarian leaders in China and Singapore. Also, many of these discussions about non-Western forms of democracy are driven by strong anti-Western sentiments, which actually, given the history many countries have with the West, is not particularly surprising. Nevertheless, I think that this shouldn't be a reason to dismiss these debates altogether. They are genuine attempts to domesticate, transform, and adopt democratic ideas to local context. Moreover, and I think that makes it actually quite interesting, is that the search for democratic innovations is not confined to so-called new democracies. Similar debates are going on in Western democracies as well, where discontent with the democratic business as usual, I think you mentioned this term, where discontent with this democratic business as usual is on the rise, and not only among truth-denying populists. So there is a need for a wider debate about what democracy is and what it should be, what democratic values are and how they are enacted in everyday life. So in my talk, I am addressing these questions, so to speak, from below, by listening to the views and experiences of people in those divergent democracies. Yes. So for this discussion, I think, and this is a little bit of a theoretical detour now, for this discussion, it is important to remind ourselves that democracy is not an objective thing that can be clearly defined and measured. In spite of extensive scholarly efforts over the last decades, democracy remains, as many authors pointing out, an unstable signifier. That means a concept that lacks clear definitions and clear boundaries to establish what falls into its conceptual scope and what falls outside. So besides this very basic definition of government by the people, it is very difficult to come up with a definition of democracy that encompasses variations across time and space. The reason for this conceptual uncertainty is that democracy as we know it developed in a rather haphazard way and is the product of historical developments in Europe over the last 200 years, including French Revolution and industrialization of the 19th century, each of them leaving their mark on the institutions and the values associated with democracy. So understanding democracy as a historical product rather than an abstract concept implies that it could have taken different forms if it had developed in different circumstances. It also means that democracy might develop into something different in the future. This might sound rather unsettling, and I find it rather unsettling. However, I think what seems to be a flaw of democracy, its fuzziness, its open-endedness. This flaw can also be the strength of democracy, and I think we should turn it into a strength because it can be reinvented, redesigned, reimagined as circumstances and people's expectations change. And this is exactly what happens during processes of democratization, but also during transformative periods in established democracies as we see it at the moment. This approach is often referred to as constructivist approach to democracy, taking account that institutions, values, and knowledge come into existence through the interpretation that evolve in social interaction and social communication, from the kitchen table to the media, from schools to the arts. In this approach, I think it's very well sort of summarized by this quote by Lawrence Whitehead, you see here and have already read probably. If democracy is viewed as a contested and to some extent unstable concept, anchored through the invocation of practical knowledge and a filter of collective deliberation, then democratization can only come about through a lengthy process of social construction that is bound to be relatively open-ended. So, and I added this image of the Parthenon. I think all of you recognize it. The iconic building on the Acropolis in Athens, and probably stands for democracy. And I like this one because what you can see is it endured 2,500 years, but it is constantly under construction. And in this case, it has to face very bad weather. And you need good shoes and a good raincoat. So far, these processes of the social construction of democracy haven't really studied in much detail. And while elite discourses are more audible, they might not necessarily reflect how people on the ground construct the new circumstances they find themselves in. So I therefore want to focus on the democratic narratives of ordinary people, taking this term of democratic narratives from Michael Savat's books. So narratives refer to storytelling, both individual and collective. They are attempts to bring disparate things together to make sense of reality. Narratives are also inherently normative, as they establish what is good and bad, what is right and wrong. So in the following, I would like to switch a little bit from this more general discussion and zoom into some empirical material which has been collected in the context of a project I was leading, and therefore I'm still bathing in these data. The project was an EU-funded FP7 project, which is now Horizon 2020, with the title Media, Conflict and Democratization, running between 2014 and 17. So as the title implies, the attempt of this project was to bring three very complex processes together, but in my talk now, I'd only look at democratization. So our fieldwork covered 4 transitional countries, Serbia, Kenya, Egypt, Kenya, and South Africa, with the idea that each of them is representing very different constellations of change and context. So in my talk today, I picked South Africa as an example, and I know this sounds a little bit exotic and far away from what most of you are doing, but I'm hoping that the view to the other end of the globe, basically, gives some food of thought to think about democratic values and how people on the ground grapple with these new circumstances. It's also the country where sort of data processing is most advanced, so therefore it was a bit easier to pick this country. So maybe just quickly, for those of you who are not too familiar with this, just sort of some markers to indicate the context. South Africa had its first free election in 1994, ending half a century of struggle against the apartheid regime that excluded the black majority from civil and political rights. And here you see an image which I find quite moving of the first election in South Africa, where people were queuing for hours and hours and hours in the hot sun to cast their first vote. And I always show this to my students here, just to remind themselves that voting is a value people have paid quite a high price for. South Africa was blessed by a charismatic leader for its transition, Nelson Mandela, but this charisma is fading now, and the problems of transition in South Africa are coming to the fore. And one of the big problems is that vast parts of the population are still living in appalling poverty. More than half is living below the poverty line. And according to the World Bank, South Africa is now the most unequal country in the world, which was for a long time Brazil. Another problem is widespread corruption. Okay, we know this story. And another problem which crystallizes more and more is the concentration of power. Some people talk about South Africa as a one-party state because the ANC, the African National Congress, is holding absolute majority since the first election in '94, and there is no sign of an opposition party that would be strong enough to break this hegemony. So you will see that when I show you some of the material from interviews, that these circumstances are reflecting in how people think about their life. Maybe also just quickly some words about sort of the method. which I think is quite important. Because in the Macadam project, we used qualitative methods and especially qualitative interviews to elicit democratic narratives. So we invited our interview partners to talk about their own involvement in recent key conflict of democratic development. But we also asked them explicitly to reflect on the state of democracy. And this kind of open-ended and qualitative approach generated immensely rich, sometimes dramatic, and I feel often heartbreaking storytelling. So far, attitudes of the people have almost exclusively relied on quantitative survey data. But the problem is that when you use survey research in unfamiliar context, it is not really clear how people interpret the terms. And even the term democracy is sometimes something people interpret in a very different way than the survey question imply. So I think there is a huge potential to use qualitative data in transitional context and to get maybe at the bottom of what is going on when we look at these backsliding. So I'm using mainly interviews for this talk by political activists, but also journalists, just to give you a bit of an idea where the material comes from. So I am looking at three themes quickly and picked some quotes. I mean, it's very difficult in 30 minutes, 25 minutes, to give you a sense of storytelling, which is obviously in the title of this talk, but hopefully get a bit of a sense how people reflect, and maybe some of this you can relate to your own knowledge and your own experience. So starting with a kind of overall question how people sort of more than 20 years after they queued for their first vote, how they think about democracy today, what are the values they associate with democracy, what do they think has been achieved, where are the shortcomings. So what you see is that when people reflect on democracy, they oscillate between hope and despair. And some saw their country as vibrant and a healthy democracy, others as fragile, adolescent, and under extreme threat. Interestingly, especially journalists have a very positive view about democracy, because in the end, with the end of censorship and the liberalization of the public sphere, they are the big winners. But as this first quote indicates, some of them are also aware that it depends very much where in the social stratum you are standing, how you think about democracy. So this person is saying the quality of democracy for people like me, and like me in this case means white, middle class, urban. The quality of democracy for people like me is very rich indeed, and it becomes less rich the further down the food chain we go. So this person is acutely aware that support of democracy depends very much where you are in the society. And when you look at how people further down the food chain, which is a slightly strange expression, when you look further down, then indeed the verdict on democracy is rather devastating. So in our sample, these are activists who are campaigning for the needs of the very poor, in particular for issues of housing, land reform, and sanitation. And most of these activists are actually themselves from these poor backgrounds, so they know very, very well what it means to live in unofficial settlements, meaning slums, without the most basic provisions like running water or toilets. And here, I think, is a quite moving and actually devastating quote. There is a new kind of apartheid, if you like, but it is a class level. It's not about anymore the color of your skin, but it's about what you have and what you don't have. So yeah, I think the word democracy in South Africa is a joke. I think there is no democracy. It's a whole competitive society. Everybody is on their way up or somewhere, but I don't know where up is. I don't want to be harsh and say the government, in my view, is puppets, but actually she does. It's puppets that are being maneuvered by capitalism, the elite who own everything, who decide. So for me, there is no democracy in South Africa. There is no democracy. So it's actually quite a devastating and actually desperate statement, and which reflects quite a lot of the interviews we have done. The other statement is also very interesting. This person is saying, so how can they say there's democracy when there is no freedom? Actually, on the basis of formal freedom and constitution, South Africa is actually quite leading and a shining example. But then he's saying, because it's still that there is no freedom yet for our community, because the rich is getting richer and the poor is getting poorer. So some of the statements, in a certain way, I was reminded of the situation of Russia in the 1990s and what followed. What you see here is that actually poverty and inequality undermines the very idea of democracy, and there's a clear anti-capitalist slant in these views. It is also quite interesting that in the last quote here, freedom is, freedom is, means socioeconomic equality, which is often overlooked, and I think quite a lot of traditional Orthodox liberal theorists would reject this. So for these people, democracy means a better life. So you could argue, is democracy, in their view, instrumental? That depends on what you get out of democracy. Is it a good weather support that falters when times are hard? When listening to the stories of these people, the distinction between output-based and value-based democracy seems to be utterly mistaken, if not cynical, I think. So I know I have to hurry up a little bit more than I thought. I would briefly also shed some light on narratives which reflect on the person. And I didn't use sort of the individual because it seems that people think about the person in a very different way. So they are emphasizing when they are fighting for housing, sanitation, and so on, that they are simply fighting for services. But in this quote, this person is saying this is a misconception. This is simply because some people think that if we give people houses, they shut up. But what we want is respect and dignity, because the poor and the working class do not count in society. For us, it's important that it is about building a society, a nation, about love for one's country. It is really about humanity that people want for tomorrow. I think that's quite a mouthful, but also quite impressive how people reflect on it. So in a certain way, these people don't want handouts or just handouts. What they want is to be respected as human beings in a very Kantian understanding, if you like, of the person. Right. Okay. I know, I do the trick now with the 2 sentences. Okay, just briefly, because I think that's very unique for the South African case, but also made me think about what democracy is and the values. And this is about sort of what I call democracy from below. So in the interviews, and probably you'll find it always when you do qualitative research on democracy, institutions are rarely mentioned. Neither parliament elections or political parties figure high, if at all, in these interviews. But instead, democracy is very much seen from the perspective of participation. Actually, in the constitution, South Africa has this commitment to participatory democracy. But what is quite interesting is that in the public imagination, participation means something more than just participation. It means protest. And some people have called South Africa protest nation. The quality of democracy is also sort of measured by the degree to which protests are taking place. And in the first quote, you see somebody who is saying, okay, the early years when protest was seen as part of our national dialogue are over, and therefore the quality of democracy is fading. So that's something very interesting to think about, how protest figures in the imagination of these people. There are about 20 to 30 protest events every day, even though it's quite difficult to count. But when you listen to the stories of these people, and actually what I want to show here is that most of them are peaceful, but there's also frightful violence going on. Involving destruction of property, even public buildings and public property. But when you listen to people talking about their involvement in protest, it becomes quite obvious that it is more than a means to shout out, to attract the attention of the media. It is actually a way of reclaiming agency in a situation where you feel completely subjected to circumstances you feel you can't change. So protest and sort of the dynamic it gives you is some way of agency, which on the one hand, you might argue, keeps democracy alive and going, but on the other hand, is also a source of something like the emergence of uncivil society, where violence called activism has become a kind of way of life, especially for the young who are unemployed. Okay, so just briefly to come to a conclusion. So what I think is that looking at these visions and narratives of democracy emerging from these interviews far away, they sound both familiar and very unfamiliar. They look very context-specific, but also universal. They address core democratic values like freedom, equality, citizenship, but they speak in a very strong local dialect and often reimagine and reinterpret what it means to them. But in the conclusion, I want to do a little bit more and return to a more general perspective, because the democratic narratives we have looked at are also part of a wider global discourse. And I think there are three themes or three observations I would highlight here, which not only apply to the South African context, but far beyond. One is the changing nature of citizenship. Citizens are becoming more demanding, and citizen politics has become more dynamic and a more dynamic and unpredictable force. From the Arab Spring to Brexit, there is an end of permissive consensus, but we don't really know what to do with this and how to integrate it. This also points to the next point, the changing nature of representation. So the more so-called unconventional forms of participation become normalized, the more existing representative institutions are losing legitimacy. And I think one of the key problems here is responsiveness, that the institutions don't have effective mechanisms to link the participatory pressure from below to institutional processes. And certainly, I think there's a redefinition of liberal values, away from mainly formal and legalistic views on liberal values, pushing towards more essentialist interpretations that include recognition, dignity, voice, values that are about to change, as I believe, the way people understand democracy and evaluate democracy, both in transitional and established democracies. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Katrin, for a great presentation and for bringing us beyond our region to other parts of the globe. Now, there will be a time for questions and answers. We will have a moving microphone. And since there is a stream, I would like to ask everyone who will raise his or her question, please introduce yourself and speak straight to the microphone. Otherwise, your voice will not be heard. And let me give a floor first, please. Yeah.
Hello, and thank you very much for very interesting presentations. My name is Olga Malinova. I'm professor of Higher School of Economics, Moscow. I have a question to Katrin Voltmer concerning your research. I remember the book edited by Harold Widra. It was a very interesting book about myths about democracy and how they worked in Eastern European transition. The whole idea was that some ideas of democracy before transition and how mythical, in a sense, how they were, what kind of effects they had in the real process. So my question is, what was your research about? Was it about actual democratic experience, or what we would mark as democratic experience, or was it more about how people could frame their dreams about better future in terms of democracy? Thank you.
Should I just? Yeah. No, I think that's a very great question. And somehow, yeah, it's how these two things hang together. Because I think democracy is not just a set of institutions. It has this, say, this utopian overflow or this utopian add-on. And you can't do democracy without understanding this. Now, people do have different dreams when they fight for democracy and then are confronted with the experience. And I think my research was mainly because, yeah, this is 20 years after the transition, how the experience basically affects the dream. And I think the dream is actually a very positive force. It helps us to accept hardship, but to only a certain degree. And I think we have to face the experience of ordinary people and can't just brush it away. I mean, in Russia it has been so obvious, yeah, that the chaos and the economic breakdown in the 1990s, it's very difficult to maintain your dream. Yeah, so it's very much the experience, but also how people interpret a democracy, yeah, in their own lives. Mm.
Yes, please, Professor Vujacic.
Veljko Vujacic from the European University of St. Petersburg. I have a question for Professor Ekiert. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I think partially clarified, you know, this turn towards authoritarianism. It's the last part that I had a problem with, the petit bourgeois part, you know. This petit bourgeoisie was traditionally demonized by Marxism. It was then demonized by liberals. And actual voting behavior, you know, research on Nazi Germany doesn't demonstrate that the petty bourgeoisie was especially supportive of Nazism. You know, Richard Hamilton's book was groundbreaking in this respect, and probably followed up by others which I'm not aware of. So it seems to me partially contradicted also by your statement about the experiences of Polish workers who feel humiliated and return back home and realize that they're not fully European. So what is the role of, you know, ressentiment, which I'll talk about tomorrow? What is the role of ressentiment, the feeling of inferiority versus the West in a status sense, not anymore in an economic sense in this mobilization? And does it make more sense to talk about, as you did mention in your talk, about the counter-revolution of the provincials against the urban elites and the intellectuals? It's really an anti-intellectual movement, and you didn't say very much about that.
Veikko, thank you so much for the question. I didn't mention those three interpretations to make a point that one of those three is right. I think you are right. All three are wrong in a way, or all three are complementary. The point I wanted to really emphasize is that when we are trying to figure out what's going on, we always look at the demand type of explanation. So what happened to those people? Why do they, voting for those populist parties? Because of the class position, because of their values, traditional views, and other things, and so on. I think that the right explanation is really to combine the two. Right? Some people are more susceptible to be unhappy about changes, and politicians are very clever in playing that game. I think that there is enough research to show that, when you look at the composition of peace government, for example, these are provincial politicians who suddenly became, national level politicians. And those provincial politicians are taking with them other provincial politicians to Warsaw capital. So we clearly see that. And there is, of course, this big group of small entrepreneurs who made a killing at the beginning of the transition in completely, deregulated, chaotic system. If you had two stores or, two restaurants, you were making zillions. And then suddenly, the normal economic relations came back. And if you had two stores, it was barely to survive, as it is the case in all the other places in the world. So those people really don't like that situation. They don't like the supermarkets coming from the West. They don't like liberal ideas, economic ideas coming from the European Union, and so on. So I think that this is a constituency. This is not the reason, but really this is the constituency with whom the anti-European, anti-liberal ideas resonate quite a big deal.
Okay. Please. Yes. Yeah. Sorry, I a little bit disadvantaged this part of the room, but your turn will be the next one. Yeah.
Andrei Sherbak, the High School of Economics. I also have a question to Professor Ekiert. As you mentioned in your presentation, Poland and Hungary are very successful economically, but still they refuse to join the Eurozone. And probably thus showing the limits of their Europeanization. And do you think it's just a coincidence, or it is a part of the story?
Well, it's this one, right? Okay. The story is complicated and simple in the following fashion, that before 2008, it was indisputable that joining the Eurozone is a big advantage for everyone. Mm-hmm. After 2008, the countries which didn't join the Eurozone were actually benefiting a great deal. So, the Polish economic growth after 2008 with the valuation of the zloty was just bonanza for Polish farmers and Polish producers and so on. So those countries learned that lesson of 2008, and they are very reluctant now to be in the situation the Slovaks were, for example. Right? The Slovaks were asked to subsidize Greek workers, and the Slovaks were saying, look, wait a second, we are earning 400 euros on average, and the Greeks are earning 1,000 euros on average. Why should we, help Greek workers and so on? So I think it's partially an economic story, and partially it's a very potent political story. I don't see on the horizon any effort on any of those countries which do not have euro at this point to try to join the zone.
Okay. Yes, please. Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is Jarosław Suchoples. I'm from Polish Embassy. I would like to ask Professor Ekiert about one thing very current, so to say. I don't want to involve you in political discussions, but a couple of days ago we had elections in Poland, local elections, and in fact, ruling party got only 1/3 votes. And opposition parties, if combined, they got, as far as I know, almost the majority. How you would interpret this fact in terms of social events, as a social phenomenon? Thank you.
Well, this is true. I was in Warsaw for the local elections in Poland. This is a very peculiar situation where all who participated claim victory, and what we see is the following: there is a big cleavage between the cities and the countryside. And that sort of follows the lines of arguments I've been making. So all the big cities and all the big positions in mayors in big cities went to the opposition parties. PiS is winning local governments in the traditional places where they were quite strong. I think that no one can claim victory at this point. And I think that getting 32% of votes in the scale of the country is, for PiS, is not a good result. This is much lower than it was in the parliamentary election. So I think, you know, the situation is not obvious at this point who is really being supported and who is not. You would expect, just to one more sentence, you would expect that all the populist policies the PiS introduced over the last 2 years, giving, you know, 500 plus, housing plus, lowering the retirement age and so on. This is an unprecedented set of very damaging populist policies that vote would go up in quite dramatic way, but it didn't. So that's something for PiS to worry in the coming elections.
Okay. Please, Professor Busygine.
My name is Irina Busygine. I am from High School of Economics in St. Petersburg, and I have a question. Or no, it's not a question. It's probably a very brief comment, but related to Professor Ekiert. And this is about Germany. You know, so you told us about Hungary and Poland, and I want to ask you something. Would you agree with me or not? If you would look from your perspective of the klein bourgeois, this petit bourgeoisie, and this kind of people and the provincial mentality, would you agree with me that this is also the situation in Germany, that we had in Germany? Imagine that Germany would not be unified almost 30 years ago. What would we have then? If even now we have probably not a split, but a very pronounced cleavage between East and West Germany, with very different relation to democracy and a lot of provincial kind of, you know, mentality at the eastern side. Would it fit to your German picture? Would it fit to your broader picture? Thank you.
I think you probably are much more qualified to answer that question.
Okay, well, you can answer both.
Okay, because I'm initially from Germany. Okay, I don't live there, so it's a little bit the observation from the outside. I think, yes, it is like two countries. When you look at geographical maps of voting behavior, it's completely divided. And the division or polarization is increasing. You also have in the East more and more voices which are basically saying, okay, nobody is actually listening to us. Sometimes, being sort of West German, I feel, what is the problem? We have a chancellor from East Germany, we have a president from East Germany. I mean, what is the problem? But learning from my own research, I think there is the need to listen to this kind of discontent which is building up in East Germany at the moment. And people do feel that they haven't been sort of valued and recognized, not only as persons, but also with their very specific history. And I think what has been probably a wrong narrative, if you like, has been the sentence that Germany has experienced two dictatorships, first National Socialism, then Communism. Now that equates sort of one-to-one National Socialism and what people experienced in the GDR, which is, I mean, de facto not really the case. So people in the GDR often feel that they can't actually say, hang on, I had a very happy childhood in the GDR. This is almost regarded as something that you are praising socialism or the communist rule. And I think there is, what is missing is a kind of subtlety about what historical experiences actually mean and bringing them in. I think, fortunately, what I think is a great thing, that some of the best films you have seen over the last years come from the East, and they are great in telling the stories of people there. But there is, for me, even surprising, such a negative feeling out there. So that I would think that the AfD is not just because they are all Nazis, it is also a kind of protest, somehow an attempt to being heard. I mean, in a certain way, a little bit like Brexit, yeah. Where people think that they haven't been recognized for decades.
Just one additional point. We have forgotten about East Germany when we look at transformations in Eastern Europe, and this is a very good example which should be brought back. Yeah. Because the amount of money which was pumped into East Germany is just unbelievable. Probably it has never been a case in history where such amount of money was pumped into a place in such a short period of time. So this tells us that the transformations are very difficult. Even if you have resources to make them as painless as possible, that means that you are right. It is more about culture, it is more about identity, it is more about subtle things. It's not about resources, it's not about money, you know, income per capita, and so on. So let's bring East Germany back.
Yeah. I think it's also maybe just a footnote. I think we shouldn't start a discussion here on this stage. We also have to I mean, it's a bit strange now, we, the West, yeah, have to rethink what we are actually exporting and what our assumptions are. Yeah? And this is exactly this. Bring economic growth, yeah, that like the flourishing landscape Kohl was talking about, and people will be happy. No, they aren't. And I think we often have a kind of mechanistic understanding of our own democracy, and suddenly looking at where it goes wrong, I find very fruitful to start a discussion about our own assumptions. Yeah. And I think East Germany is actually quite a fascinating case for this.
Okay. Yes, please. Here is in the middle. Yeah.
Natalia Kulinka, University of California in Santa Cruz. I'm grateful Professor Voltmer for bringing about this idea that what we think about democracy should be reconsidered. And I was surprised how similar the attitudes toward what democracy should be that she found in South Africa. So how similar this attitude is to what the majority of Soviet people, workers included, fought in the late 80s, early 90s when they tried to reform the Soviet Union. In this regard, I have a question about whether we usually our understanding of democracy comes from the pair liberal democratic, and we know that under liberal and under democratic, we have a different set of values. So in the regard of this change in our understanding of democracy, should we actually disentangle democracy from liberalism?
Yeah, I would say that's a bit dangerous because Orban is trying this. I would say we should disentangle what we mean by liberal, because it always comes in a package, and human rights are coming in the same package as, in my view, let's say it, a very extreme form of market liberalism, and I think this is not the same. And in this package, notions of justice have been forgotten largely. So I would agree with you, we have to unpack it, but I would sort of poke at what we mean by liberal. Yeah, some elements of what we put into this liberal package are basically undisputable, like human rights or the rule of law. Yeah, but is this kind of market liberalism really necessary to build democracy? I mean, just thinking back of the German history. Okay, I grew up in the 1950s, where the German economic miracle was based on what was called a social market economy, which was extremely sort of buffered by social and welfare state measures. So the German economy, the German democracy wouldn't have survived now. Okay, there were the Americans who had a hand on it. But I think what we see at the moment, post-89, is that two trajectories meet. One is the democratization of a large number of non-Western countries. And on the other side, this coincides with an extreme form of market liberalism. In some countries, it has led to wealth. In other countries, and probably quite a lot of countries, it has led to disaster. And I think IMF and quite a lot of international organizations are actually rethinking their approach, because they see that these negative fallouts of this. Yeah, I think unpacking is a good thing to do.
If I may, there are three very simple questions which simply indicate that you can unpack it, but you cannot divorce it.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So, the first question is, what is the role of the people? The second question is, who are the people? Yes. And the third question is how some people can be protected from the people. And that's the liberal element in all of that, without which this is all not going to work.
Yes.
Let me behave in pretty much non-democratic way and usurp the power of a chair by myself. First, let me thank our both presenters for their talks and our audience for questions and comments. And second, there is a brief announcement. There will be a coffee break. The coffee will be served at this floor, and the third floor, one floor down this floor. We have half an hour, and after that we'll continue through sessions on panels. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks. I think that was a good start.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I have a number of questions and comments, but being a chair, I restrain myself.
I think we'll have some opportunity.
Yeah. Well, we'll talk. Yeah. Thanks so much for your assistance. Yeah.